Hello, everybody, and welcome to Torah study. We have thrown open the doors and filled the classroom with Torah scholars of all sorts, and we're happy to welcome you. I'm going to say who is on the screen, starting in the order as you appear on my screen. Sid Josephi, Janet Cheel, Judy Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Francis Budd, Carol Klingen, Nancy Coomer, Raya Drebin, Sylvia Schatz, and Ruth Addis and Alan Addis. Hi, everyone, and hi to everyone out there watching. Today we have, I think, an interesting topic which comes from the book of Numbers. You hopefully saw the attachment on the calendar, but even if you didn't, don't worry. I'm going to read to us from chapter 35 in the book of Numbers. And before I start reading, let me just situate us in where we are in the Bible. We are at the penultimate chapter of the book of Numbers. And the Israelites at this point are very close to the promised land. They are on the east side of the Jordan River. When we think of Israel, we think of the west side of the Jordan River. And they are on the east side, and they're going to come in across, going from east to west. So that's where they are, and lots of preparations are now happening to prepare them for their new life in the promised land. And so what we focus on today follows a list of who's who in the tribal system, and it tells us many different laws about which land people will receive, what borders the land will have, and then the 11 of 12 tribes are given land in different sections of the country. However, the Levites, because they are servants of the later the temple, but at this point servants of God in the tabernacle, they receive tithes, the 10th part of people's produce and their herd and so on. They do get they receive taxes, so to speak, but they don't own land. And within the tribal areas that each tribe receives, there are some cities, probably about, on average, 4 Levite cities that are to be established. So that's what we're going to read about. And then within those Levite cities are cities of refuge. So here we go. The Lord spoke to Moses in the steppes of Moab at the Jordan near Jericho, saying, "Instruct the Israelite people to assign out of the holdings apportioned to them towns for the Levites to dwell in. You shall also assign to the Levites pasture land around the towns. The town shall be theirs to dwell in, and the pasture shall be for the cattle they own, and all other beasts. The town pasture that you are to assign to the Levites shall extend 1,000 cubits outside the town wall all around. You shall measure off 2,000 cubits outside the town on the east side, 2,000 on the south side, 2,000 on the west side, and 2,000 on the north side, with the town in the center. That shall be the pasture for their towns." Okay. The towns that you assign to the Levites shall comprise the 6 cities of refuge that you are to designate for a manslayer to flee to which you shall add 42 towns. Thus the total of the towns that you assign to the Levites shall be 48 towns with their pasture. In assigning towns from the holdings of the Israelites, take more from the larger groups and less from the smaller, so that each assigns towns to the Levites in proportion to the share it receives. Moving right along, the Lord spoke to Moses, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, When you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you shall provide yourselves with places to serve you as cities of refuge, to which a manslayer who has killed a person unintentionally may flee. The cities shall serve you as a refuge from the avenger, so that the manslayer may not die unless he has stood trial before the assembly. The towns that you thus assign shall be 6 cities of refuge in all. 3 cities shall be designated beyond the Jordan, and the other 3 shall be designated in the land of Canaan. They shall serve as cities of refuge. These 6 cities shall serve the Israelites and the resident aliens among them for refuge, so that anybody who kills a person unintentionally may flee there. Anyone, however, who strikes another with an iron object so that death results is a murderer. The murderer must be put to death. If he struck him with a stone tool that could cause death and death resulted, he is a murderer. The murderer must be put to death. Similarly, if the object with which he struck him was a wooden tool that could cause death and death resulted, he is a murderer. The murderer must be put to death. The blood avenger himself shall be the murderer to death. The blood avenger himself shall put the murderer to death. It is he who shall put him to death upon encounter. So, too, if he pushed him in hate or hurled something at him on purpose and death resulted, or if he struck him with his hand in enmity and death resulted, the assailant shall be put to death. He is a murderer. The blood avenger shall put the murderer to death upon encounter. But if he pushed him without malice aforethought, or hurled any object at him unintentionally, or inadvertently dropped upon him a deadly object of stone, and death resulted, though he was not an enemy of his and did not seek his harm, in such cases the assembly shall decide between the slayer and the blood avenger. The assembly shall protect the manslayer from the blood avenger, and the assembly shall restore him to the city of refuge to which he fled, and there he shall remain until the death of the high priest. But if the manslayer ever goes out the limits of the city of refuge to which he had fled, and the blood avenger comes upon him outside the limits of his city of refuge, and the blood avenger kills the manslayer, there is no blood guilt on his account, for he must remain inside his city of refuge until the death of the high priest. After the death of the high priest, the manslayer may return to his landholding. Such shall be your law of procedure throughout the ages in all your settlements. If anyone kills a person, the manslayer may be executed only on the evidence of witnesses. The testimony of a single witness against a person shall not suffice for a sentence of death. You may not accept a ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of a capital crime, because he must be put to death. Nor may you accept ransom in lieu of flight to a city of refuge, enabling one to return to live on his land before the death of the priest. You shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land, and the land can have no expiation for blood that is shed on it. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in which I myself abide, for I, the Lord, abide among the Israelite people. I realized that was a long stretch with many different concepts in it. And in summary, we see that God told Moses to instruct the Israelites to assign the Levites out of the other tribes' holdings, towns and pastures for each city of Levites. And the Israelites were to assign the Levites 48 towns in all, of which 6 were to be cities of refuge, and the Israelites were to have more towns for the Levites in larger areas, larger tribes, and fewer in smaller. And they talk about corroborating witnesses that are needed to prove a crime. And then there's a lot of detail about the idea of a city of refuge, who gets to going there and who gets to coming out of there, and lots more. So I'd like to open it up to the scholars on the screen, and looking, if you can, to some extent, to the order in which we read things earlier, comments earlier and later. Who would like to? Carol, I see your hand. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Yep. I remember about cities of refuge, not in the kind of detail that you have reminded us, but the concept of it. And so most of the Parsha is about what happens to the manslayer, but the part that I did not remember at all is that these are in deliberately Levite towns.
Yes.
And that the sort of sabbatical or the jubilee for these people is when the high priest dies. So I'm wondering, why is that connection between the priests and the cities of refuge?
Yeah.
Is it meant to be that they're regarded as more just, or I just can't think of what would be the reason.
Well, that's a really great question, and I was wondering about that too. Does anyone want to posit an answer before I give you what I've found in my little bit of research? No hands going up. Okay, so what I found is looking back at some commentary on exactly your question. What is the origin of the cities of refuge? So I believe that this is what I've read, that in many ancient cultures, deities were considered to extend their religious sanctuary and all to everybody that lived in that area and the surrounding areas. So the idea that we've heard about a person who is wrongly accused and is about to be, and someone is chasing him, they would run and hold onto the altar, right? Mm-hmm. We see that in the book of Kings and Samuel, when in those times of war, when people were, when blood of vengeance was apparently in practice, people who in very ancient times would be able, the deities, their various gods would have a city and they would have a sanctuary, and if somebody was wrongly accused and was about to be murdered, they could run and hide in that sanctuary. But then the Israelite law didn't want to sanction the pagan deities as places of sanctuary, which of course they had supposedly destroyed. So they did the next best thing, which was the cities where the Levites lived, who were sacred to God, and that became a way of containing it to certain areas. One can imagine that the average population in an average town was not interested in becoming a city of refuge because they were worried about what kind of people would be running into their city for sanctuary. And also they would be afraid of the avengers who would be coming in to the city. And in fact, what I read is that over time, these general rights of asylum that were provided to people who were fleeing someone who wanted to murder them were curtailed, because some of these sanctuaries had become notorious hotbeds for crime. So you go murder someone and then you run to the sanctuary of your deity to hide there. And people, the local folk, were not happy about that, because then there would be a murder following that one. And so the tradition is to assume that these cities were curtailed to 6 cities out of 48 Levite cities, as a way of not having too many places for sanctuary, because you know how we feel about having a prison built in our town. People don't want to have those kinds of situations. And so it was limited to 6. That's a theory, may or may not be correct. We don't know. So that's the connection to the Levite cities that I could find. I wanted to understand that. Yes, Alan.
Didn't you say before that there were a total of 28 cities of which 6 were, all right.
48.
48.
48.
48. Oh, I thought it was
48,
20.
and then 48, and then of those cities, the sanctuary cities were, according to the Bible, 3 in the east, on the east of the Jordan River, and 3 in the land of Canaan, which is west of the Jordan. But later on in Jewish history, when the East Bank was no longer under Israelite rule, then there apparently, according to the Talmud, which is written much later, 6 cities were now in the Canaanite, in west of the Jordan. There are also interesting descriptions in the Talmud, in Tractate Makot, where they talk about how it was important to make these cities known and accessible. And it describes that there were signposts that said Arei Miklat, this way to the sanctuary city, and also that the roads had to be well tended so that if someone was really fleeing for their life, they wouldn't have difficulty getting there because the road was overgrown and it wasn't clear where you had to go. Again, this is, we don't know if that was historically so, but that was the assumption, or at least the aspiration in the Talmud. Nancy, I see your hand, and afterwards Judy.
Well, in some ways it reminds me of children's games where it's, you know, there's an area that's home free, you know, you can't touch me here. And even in baseball, you know, that once you hit the base, no one can touch you there. But my question is, and I think that's what Carol was asking also, why the linkage to the death of the high priest?
That wasn't actually what she asked, but that's a great question to add in, because it's all kind of connected. The high priest, of course, being from the tribe of Levite. So the question of the high priest is not explained in the Torah, but there are other sources that explain it. And the idea was that no harm would be, once the high priest died, you the murderer was then free to go. And that, not the murderer, the manslayer was free to go. And the question is, why? And there are different answers, but one of them is that the high priest was considered to be the holiest and most righteous person in the land, and his death as a servant of God right in the temple would make expiation in and of itself for all the sins of the people. And therefore the sins of murder, which are basically unforgivable for manslaughter, murder you get put to death, but the manslaughterer's sin would be expiated and he would be free to go, which is a very interesting and confusing idea, that one person's death gives forgiveness to others. But Maimonides says that it's because when the high priest died, it would be such a national time of grief that people would not busy themselves with vengeance. They would be distraught and weeping, and they'd let it go, which is a nice answer to it. But the bottom line is we don't actually have an explanation. But there is one very nice midrash that appears in the Mishnah, which says that the mother of the high priest, and some versions say the mother of the high priest and his sisters, busied themselves by making clothes for the manslayers, the manslaughterers in the cities of refuge, so that they wouldn't pray for the death of the high priest, because their freedom was linked to the death of the high priest. So if you were stuck, you know how hard isolation feels. These guys were lifetime sentenced in a city not their own, and they would understandably pray, well, let the guy die already, and then we can go free. So there's this nice midrash that the mother of the high priest and his sisters would give them gifts, bring them clothes, so that they would have good feelings and not pray for that.
But it doesn't say that their action was forgiven. It says that their sentence was commuted.
Right.
I mean, and there's a difference.
Right. There is definitely a difference. And the Talmud argues about these differences, but basically they come down mostly in Tractate Makot, where this is dealt with at length. They come down mostly on the expiation of sin through the death of such a highly spiritual leader. But today there are other situations that can provide for the commuting of a sentence. So I'm going to change now to Judy. You had your hand up, and then Raya.
I actually just go back to the very beginning and the comment. As I started to read this, I thought, my goodness, it sounds like the planned communities that evolved in the United States, like Levittown and any of the planned communities all over the country, particularly after World War II, when a lot of veterans were coming back. And communities were planned this way, that a certain number of houses, a certain amount of land between the houses and the schools and so forth. And I thought it was really quite amazing that it was happening even then.
Then. And it's very interesting that they were not given a share, a land holding in the land, because they were going to receive the tithes from others. But the city that was given to them had to be surrounded by fields, because they would have animals, and their animals would need somewhere to roam. But that wouldn't be something that they owned in a personal way, each individual perhaps. But they certainly make that built in and explicit, because you can imagine that otherwise people wouldn't necessarily be so happy to populate parts of their land, give up parts of their land for these Levite cities, and maybe they would have made them too small, and so on. Going back to what you said, Carol, about the Levites and the cities of refuge, part of this perhaps is also that they needed the cities where refuge was provided to be of a certain medium size, not too big and not too small. The Talmud talks about that too. It says it had to not be too small, so that food was scarce, because there weren't enough people working to produce food, and people would have to go out to hunt their own food, because then there goes the problem with not leaving the city. And it shouldn't be too big, so that the avenger couldn't sneak into the city and be camouflaged amongst big crowds in the marketplace. So it had to be just the right size, and that the cities of the Levites were also relatively small and and they were just medium sized, not too big and not too small. Raya first, and then David.
Oh, okay.
Apparently, the person, whether it's murder or manslaughter or manslayer, has to have a trial before, at least he has to appear before the assembly. So he has to be caught. He can't just flee. And I'm wondering, the assembly is who is the assembly?
Two excellent points that you're raising.
And I have another question.
Okay.
Who is the avenger? Who is the blood avenger?
Okay.
Is it anybody in the family, or is it limited?
I think it's limited, but I actually don't know the answer for sure. I would imagine that it would be his closest male relatives, perhaps children, perhaps brothers, but I don't know the answer, I'm sorry. But what you said is that in the order of proceedings, does he have to first get a trial, or does he first flee? So the answer is he first flees. After there's been an event of death, and a certain person is now to blame or suspected of being to blame, what they have to do is run for their life, because this concept of a blood avenger was a real thing. And the first thing was to save their life and get to as the closest city of sanctuary. And then they would be called by the courts to come and be on trial. And they would be taken under guard from the sanctuary city to where the court was. I mean, it wouldn't be in the sanctuary city. And they would go and there would be a trial. And then they would, if they were found to be not guilty of murder, but needing to, but rather manslaughter, they would be escorted back for their safety so that the blood avenger couldn't avenge them en route. So the question as to who judges them. So they say the congregation. It's in chapter 35, verse 25. And the congregation shall restore him to the city of refuge from where he fled. And what they're referring to is the rabbis of the Talmud learn that the word kol ha'edah is used here, and it's also used talking about the spies, who were 10 bad ones and 2 good ones. So that's where they learn the idea of a minyan of 10. And they're saying there were 10, the same word is used here as there. Therefore, 10 people have to be at the trial. It has to be witnessed by at least 10 people, in addition to the judges. So those people who are at the trial are responsible to return the person to their city of refuge. Did I answer all the questions?
Yes, except suppose he flees somewhere else.
You mean
And not to a city of refuge.
Then he's fair game for his avenger. The avenger finds out where he is. There are no protections.
He doesn't have to be tried at all.
Does have to be tried, but if he's in the legal system of those days, was that you are kept safely before your trial. And
if you go there to a refuge.
Go to the right place. And also it says in the Talmud that if a person who is running for their life comes to a city of refuge, their first port of call is the elders of the town. They have to go to wherever the elders hold council and say why they're there and who they're running from. And then they're given sanctuary. And also the courts are informed that we've got a manslaughterer in our, or a person running for their life in our midst. So I see that there was David's hand and Janet and also Francis. So I want to mention about the categories of murder and manslaughter, but I'll do that afterwards. Let's go straight to you, David.
My question was more on, suggestion was more on the size of the land that each tribe had to give to the Levites. So when they talk about, I had to look up what a cubit was and found out that it was the length of your arm.
Yeah.
And it's about 18 inches. And so it looks like 3,000 feet or 100 yards was the land on either side of the town, east, west, south, and north. So it sounded like each tribe had to give quite a bit of land up.
Right.
As far as this was concerned, for pasture.
Right.
It didn't say how big the town was, however.
No, it didn't say that, but it did say that the larger tribal lands would have more Levite cities in them than the smaller tribal lands, because they were taking into account, this is a sacrifice to give up this land. But I guess there was always, or certain about always, there's always now a tension between, were these Levites just getting off so lucky? Mm-hmm. They get the taxes, they get a place to live, they get all of this, and all they have to do is serve in the temple or the tabernacle and check the people who are lepers and do a few things. But here we see they also had another responsibility, which was the responsibility of looking after people who were seeking refuge, mm-hmm. and making sure that they're safe and provided for, which was not such a popular assignment.
it sounded like almost they had a football field, north, south, east, and west around the town. So it was quite a large
Quite a
piece
large
of land.
amount of land. Well, thank you for checking the measurements and converting them into something familiar. Okay, that's great. Janet and then Francis.
Oh, I wanted to ask the question, is the legal law, this law that was established with Moses when Yitro had advised him to have people help him out because he felt so wary of all the things, all the laws that he had to, all the things that he had to do. And is this an outgrowth or is this a continuation of the laws that, or that was done during Moses' time?
These laws were laws that, according to the Torah, that God gave to Moses, and Moses laid them out somewhat in an as-needed version while they were in the desert, although some were given well in advance of arriving at the land. But this, before they crossed over the Jordan into Canaan, they got a whole lot of laws about when you live in the land, this is what you're going to have to do. But they did not apply during the time they were in the desert. These were laws for when you get there.
I see. So is this a continuation of the legal system that he established?
Yes.
I see.
That's according.
And I know this is probably his family, the manslaughter, the person who was slain, his family was left out. In other words, he came to the cities of refuge by himself and lived there by himself until the
high priest died.
High priest died.
Yes, it does appear that way, that it was not a family plan.
Yeah.
It wasn't that.
So that alone is punishment.
And the question that I would wonder is, okay, they can't avenge this man who they are so angry with and who they feel they have a responsibility to redeem, to avenge. So what about their vulnerable family, the wife and kids back on the farm? Were they at risk? Since
that's another question.
Where he is.
That's right. The avenger could do harm.
Information in this text, or I didn't see any midrashim about that, but it seems he had to go alone.
I see. And who would protect his family? They don't mention.
They don't mention.
I see.
Francis, you had your hand up next.
Does the high priest have a role in the trial?
I can't hear you. Can you talk a little closer?
Does the high priest have a role in the trial?
I don't think so. I think that the high priest had other responsibilities and not legal ones. They were actually judges and elders who had legal expertise as opposed to ritual expertise. I think that the high priest was not involved in the actual trials.
Okay, so he was just involved with the religious part of the community.
I
would have been like a DA or something like that.
No, I don't think he was like the DA. Did I see your hand, Carol?
Yes, just an easy question, which is, would everybody have known where these cities of refuge were? Would you, in your life, just say to yourself, just in case I need to know this, I'm tucking away that information? You couldn't Google it or look on a map.
Right. You couldn't Google it, and you couldn't put it in your GPS just in case. Well, that's why the Talmud says that throughout the land at crossroads, there should be signs that say, this way to the city of refuge, and that there should be good roads leading that way. But it's a good question. I would imagine that people didn't do a lot of traveling, and therefore they would be in their particular tribal land. And hopefully, just as other information is conveyed, it would be conveyed to them as well. But yes, it's a good question. So let's move to the question now of one other piece that I want to throw in is that I was looking at origins of this strange law of the avenger and the justice system and so on. And apparently in Greek mythology, which I must admit I know a very limited amount, there is a trilogy called Oresteia, which is a 4th century Greek trilogy. And one of the principal themes in this trilogy is the contrast between revenge and justice, as well as a transition from personal vendetta to organized litigation. And I liked reading that because this is really a transitional move where today the idea of family being able to avenge the dead in their family is absolutely not allowed. And here they're trying to mitigate so that it would reduce the kind of blood vengeance by providing a legal system that would try the person, and there would be criteria for yay or nay. And what are these criteria? We heard repeatedly that the murderer must die. So the death penalty, which we've just had carried out in this country this week, and it shocks many people, I am sure, is very clearly stated in the Torah. The murderer will die. However, to get the murderer into the category of a intentional and witnessed murder is not an easy job. So I want to read you a little midrash that is a translation from what's written in the Mishnah and the Gemara. First of all, it says that at these trials, the judge would admonish the witnesses in capital cases not to testify based on conjecture, that is, circumstantial evidence, or hearsay, for the court would scrutinize the witnesses' evidence by cross-examination and inquiry. And the word that they use for cross-examination and investigation is darosh darash. You will surely really dig at it. To doresh is to investigate, and darosh darash is like a double emphasis on this need to really be thorough. So they give an example of what does it mean to not judge based on conjecture. And there's in the Mishnah, there's a midrash that says, the judge told the witnesses that if the witness saw the defendant running after the victim into a ruin, and the witness pursued the defendant and found the defendant with a bloody sword in hand and the victim writhing in agony, then the judge would tell the witness that the witness saw nothing and did not actually witness the murder. It was taught in one of the extraneous texts of the Talmud that Rabbi Shimon ben Shetach said that he once did see a man pursuing his fellow into a ruin, and when Rabbi Shimon ben Shetach ran after the man, he saw him with bloody sword in hand and the murdered man writhing. Rabbi Shimon ben Shetach exclaimed to the man, "Wicked man, who slew this man? It is either you or I. But what can I do, since your life does not rest in my hands? For it is written in the Torah, at the mouth of 2 witnesses shall he who is to die be put to death. May he who knows one's thoughts, that is God, exact vengeance from him who slew his fellow." And the Gemara reports that before they moved from that place, a serpent bit the murderer and he died. So it's a nice, simple end to the story. But the example itself is a very good example, because when you heard me read it, you probably thought, oh, come on. He saw the guy running after he saw the murderer running after the victim. He gets inside and there's the victim writhing in pain or murdered. And the other guy is the perpetrator, or somebody is holding a bloody sword. You put 2 and 2 together, you know who murdered him, right? But according to to Jewish law of this time, you don't know, because you did not see him stick the
Well,
sword.
is it because you didn't see him, or because there weren't two people who saw it?
Both. You didn't actually witness it, and you needed two people anyway to actually see him do it. And according to what the Talmud says in a different tractate, they talk about the person had to have been duly warned before committing this crime, and being stopped and saying, hey, wait a minute, do you realize if you do that, you're going to get the death sentence? And then he does it anyway, and two people see it, you're good to go, as in he's worthy of the death sentence. But what are the likelihood of having these two witnesses right there giving this warning and being able to prevent it? Perhaps it did happen. But the purpose of the Midrash here is to emphasize that it is not a simple matter to say, I know for sure, unless you personally saw it happening. And there's long discussions, which I didn't bring because they're too complex, too long and running on, about what if two witnesses saw, did they have to both be at the same place with each other and simultaneously see the act? What if one was on a different side of the room or different side of the street? What does it mean that they both saw the same thing? And they're very strict about not putting two and two together, other than I actually saw it and he actually saw it, and we both agree. So while we do hear that the death sentence is very strongly emphasized, the way to get to it isn't so simple.
Is safeguarded, yeah.
Yes. Raya.
When did they go from the assembly to a judge?
I don't know. I think that the judge was
Part of the assembly?
I think the judge was above the assembly, that there would be possibly 3 judges or more for a capital case, and there would also be 10 people of the assembly there to, so that it wasn't a kind of like a backroom trial. It was real, it was witnessed, and it was...
is it ever discussed in the Torah, or is it only in the Talmud?
I don't, if it is, I can't remember where it is. I'm not aware of that. I wanted to also review what the rabbinical differentiations between murder and manslaughter. So there would be certain situations where, for example, somebody is killed, and the assumption is that you were there and you did it, and you're guilty, and actually the person was just walking by and happened to be there, and the actual murderer managed to sneak away before a witness came, and he's completely innocent. Such a person who's completely innocent would not have to spend the rest of his days in a city of refuge. If the court found this person completely innocent, they're free to go. The second category would be negligence, which required an exile to the city of refuge. And that would be a situation where someone is killed as a result of a legal activity which the perpetrator was not required to perform. So in other words, they weren't breaking the law in what they were doing, which could be construction or most of the examples they give have to do with building construction. Like you are lifting a heavy thing on a roof and you don't take adequate precautions, and it slips out of your hand and falls off the building and kills somebody at the bottom. Or you don't take proper precautions with the ladder you're using and you fall and you land on someone, or you drop something. So they give a lot of building types of accidents that could occur. But in other words, the person wasn't doing anything intentionally wrong, didn't mean to do any harm, but he also wasn't careful. So say, for example, he should have used a safety hoist to do what he was doing, but he just skipped that step and the thing dropped and killed someone. Then there's severe carelessness, which seems like negligence, but apparently it's different. And that's which exile is insufficient. This situation arises when someone is accidentally killed as a result of an illegal activity by the perpetrator. For example, this situation arises if a shopkeeper fails to maintain their property and it collapses and kills a legitimate customer. So what they did wasn't intending to kill anybody, but they severe carelessness of not maintaining, removing ice from their sidewalk when their store was open, and somebody legitimately comes to buy, slips on the ice and gets killed. The person is the storekeeper would be responsible because of his severe carelessness. And the third is murder, where someone is their genuine murder, and then they're subject to the death penalty. So there'd be two categories of ways in which manslaughter would put someone into exile for the rest of their life, or sorry, for the rest of the life of the high priest, which might be the rest of their life too. One case where they go home free, and one case where they are put to death. Raya.
Well, I don't want to go too deeply into this, but in American law, for example, manslaughter can also be when you intend not to kill, but when somebody attacks you, and self-defense and you use excessive force, and or the crime of passion.
A crime of passion is counted as not murder?
Manslaughter, yeah, in some states.
Because you just couldn't help yourself.
Yeah, you were so provoked.
So provoked. Fair enough. I mean, I don't know, fair enough, but that's very interesting. There was a discussion also along the way in the Talmud that said that if a burglar breaks into your house at night and you defend yourself and land up killing them, you are not responsible because they invaded your space, and therefore you are not guilty of murder, but rather manslaughter. But I think in this case, even then, you would not be sent off to exile because it says in the Torah that you're allowed to defend yourself. And if someone comes into your house in the dead of night and there's no electricity or street lights outside that could help you figure things out, you want to protect yourself from a potential murderer, you can kill him and no one can do you any harm for that. So these are very interesting.
Yes, modern law contains many of those things as well.
So that is very interesting to hear where these ancient laws kind of fade away and where they don't, and they stay with us to this day. Let's give Sylvia a chance first, and then David and Nancy.
This is just going back, 3 cities on one side of the Jordan and 3 on the other. However, there were many fewer people on that east bank.
Correct.
So why was that so unequal? Is it just, I don't know why, that's the question. Why only 3 on one side? It would seem 4 and 2 would be better if they're doing 6.
I think that's a great question, and the rabbis of the Talmud thought that too, and they debated, and actually not the rabbis of the Talmud, biblical critics debate that question, and they say that these are clearly later writings from perhaps the time of Josiah, and it reflects a political reality that is different than that existed at a different time, but that once the East Bank was no longer under Israelite rule, which happened fairly early on, then all 6 moved to the other side. It's a very good question. And why only 6? Why not 12?
Yeah.
For all of or at least 11, since the Levites didn't have a land territory. But some of the tribes, I guess, were quite small. Their land holdings were small and you could kind of combine them. But that's a good question. We don't know those answers. Or I don't know the answers. Maybe others do. David.
it certainly seems like there's a lot of description about various types of murders, manslaughter, crimes that were committed during this period of time, although it might have been reported many years later. But was there a scribe, for example, like if we go to a lawyer's office right now, we see all the case studies, all the books of case studies. Were there case studies kept? Were there scribes to describe how many people were in refuge places? Who kept track of all that? Did the high priest have a book of all the people in his refuge center?
That's a great question, and I have not heard of that. I think that there were scribes who lived and wrote down historical and political events of their day, but I don't know that they kept these kind of legal notes. I may just not know about stuff that it was out there, but we do know that there were scribes as early as the 5th century, because Ezra was known as Ezra the scribe, and also he was involved in the canonizing of the Bible. So people were writing things down and organizing written material, but certainly later on in the period of the Second Temple, a lot of stuff was written down about proceedings that are then quoted in the Talmud, but actual stuff that you might find in a Geniza somewhere, like the Geniza in Cairo, about all of this information, I am not aware of it.
Well, it certainly sounds like there were a lot of, to make these laws and to make these punishments, it certainly sounds like there must have been a lot of murders.
Well, it does sound like that, or maybe they just really wanted to prevent it, but yes. Nancy and then Francis.
I'm struck by the careful distinctions between different types of murders or killings and the procedures. And I'm wondering, in the historical development of law, of systems of justice, where does this fall? Had any other groups developed similar systems of justice before this, or yeah?
We know of Hammurabi, first of all, and Hammurabi's laws were written in stone and were in existence.
They were etched in stone. Yeah,
and they were before the giving of the Torah. And so they were a very early system of law, and they had some things that are incorporated in the Torah, and they would seem to be just kind of common sense civil law. And then there are some things that are seem to us quite horrific. One of the things that comes to mind is if you have a contractor who builds a house for you and he does a bad job and the ceiling caves in and your child gets killed, his punishment is that you go and kill his child.
Oh, okay.
Not such a good plan. That one really stuck in my mind. And there were other examples that seemed to bring more vengeance into the mix rather than, say, a legal punishment or a financial compensation. So the earlier laws of Hammurabi seem to be, I would say, toned down and more advanced in the Torah laws, but even these laws have evolved and changed and are not practiced quite the same way. Raya.
When did they stop having blood avengers and having the government or the community provide for the killing of the person? I remember there are things of people being stoned to death for certain crimes. Right. Now, was that individual? I mean, for example, the women who were committed adultery, they were stoned to death. Was that done by the husbands or family, or was this done by some community? You don't know.
I don't know. I would imagine that there were probably some people who were affiliated with the Beit Din, with the legal system who were to carry that out. There were also various other punishments like lashes, and they had people who kind of worked for the court who gave lashes, and you weren't allowed to exceed 39 lashes because it was assumed that if you did, you could kill the person, and you don't want to kill them, you just want to really punish them. And so it would be customary to give less than 39 just so that you don't push that limit. And that was a sort of legally enforced procedure that wasn't randomly done by whoever wants to beat the guy up. There were people whose job it was to be a lasher.
Is there any book that talks about how this evolved?
I bet there is, but I haven't looked into it, and so I don't know the answer.
That's your assignment, Ryan.
I guess so.
Google it. I bet you'll find some.
Yeah, I will look. I
You'll
will
find
look.
some resources, and probably several. It's a great question. When did that really pass away, the Avenger idea, and only a legal system? And who did the killing? Yes, Sylvia.
Well, there's a saying that he who is innocent casts the first stone. So that's been going on for a long time. And that's one of the things that you say, yeah, be careful who is going to start throwing stones. So it's a custom, it's a reflection of the custom of the time and what was going to go on.
Interesting, yes. Thank you. And Francis and then Janet, and then I think we're going to have to
Hey,
wrap
I'm finally getting my question. First of all, the accidents under the construction are probably the beginning of OSHA, which is quite prominent today.
OSHA, yes.
But okay, so getting back to the high priest was probably the only guy that protected the man that was in the asylum cities. And so as long as the high priest was there to protect him, he felt protected. But once the high priest died, there was no one there to protect him, like a priest visits criminals and stands behind them in prison and all this. So maybe that's what the high priest did. And once he wasn't there, the guy better go because he had no one else to protect him.
I think that the high priest lived in Jerusalem or later in Jerusalem because that's where the temple was.
You mean there was no priest?
But there were priests. There was a high priest, and then there were priests who were just regular priests, and they actually did a rotation of service, priests and Levites. They didn't all work at the same time at the temple. The whole interesting part of the Talmud that talks about the rotation of priestly families that would go up for something like 2 weeks twice a year or 1 week twice a year, and they would do certain temple jobs, and there'd be kind of like a skeleton crew who were permanently on the permanent force at the temple, but the others rotated through and would be away from their families for that period of time of their rotation. So I think you are definitely onto it in terms of the role of the priest was often also a public health official. Like the priest would have to diagnose contagious skin conditions and decide who would go into quarantine, and then he would have to visit them in quarantine to see how they're progressing and whether they're safe to come back. So they had some jobs that were perhaps not the most sought after positions, but were jobs that were considered sacred. So I think that the connection to the cities of refuge being in Levite cities strongly supports that argument. I just think that the high priest was not a direct protector, although if an avenger came in to the city of refuge, I don't know how the high priest would function. Maybe he had a particular role, but I'm not aware of it. There was one more hand up, I thought.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, in the Eitz Chaim, it says, this system, cities of refuge were abolished by the monarchy, which set up a court system to try all who were accused of crimes. Cities of refuge were an archaic institution, and some of them were lost after the reign of King Solomon.
Well, thank you. So that answers our question. Great. Thank you so much for bringing that source in. That's the Eitz Chaim Chumash, the Hebrew Bible used generally in conservative congregations, and it has wonderful insights that are that add a modern gloss onto these very ancient biblical texts. So I believe that we are out of time. I want to thank all of you on my screen for coming on board and making this so much richer and more interesting by having lots of voices and weighing in on it. And I would like to also extend an invitation to everybody who's out there to, if you would like to be a participant, send me an email by the end of the week, by the end of Friday, so that I can bring out the roster, fill out the roster. I want to not have more than 12 boxes on my screen so that people's faces don't get too small on your screen or mine. So the first 12 will be in the class next week, and I look forward to seeing you very much. Please keep coming again. And thank you to all of you at home who I hope learned and enjoyed watching this class. So thank you to all of you, and let's give a wave.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.